2036 Sword Emperor Qualifications First Trial, 2. While Yuan stood surrounded by thousands of masked men, the other participants were still making their way toward the end of the path. Although many had figured out the trial's pattern just as quickly as Yuan, they struggled to overcome their opponents. Their sword auras lacked the overwhelming force Yuan possessed, requiring multiple strikes to break through the masked men's defenses. Of course, Tian Yuesheng was an exception. As expected of the number one young genius in the Nine Heavens, he had reached the end of the path nearly at the same time as Yuan. The spectators watching this were simply left dumbfounded by Yuan's unexpected prowess and talents.
Heavens, his pace is slightly faster than the heavenly sun. Maybe I've underestimated him a little too much. His fighting experience is also terrifyingly high, something I'd only expect from the older generation. Where did a genius like him come from? And how come I've never heard of him? He's probably already well known but is hiding his identity for whatever reason.
The spectators began trying to speculate Yuan's identity as he fought the thousands of masked men, constantly using all three types of sword aura. Though everyone participating in the Sword Emperor qualifications was at least in the God Ascension realm, their cultivation didn't really matter since only sword aura could get past the masked men's aura. That said, it didn't mean their cultivation wasn't important, since it allowed them to fight without getting tired easily. Time continued to pass. Although the Sword Emperor qualifications had just begun, the spectators were already on the edge of their seats from watching Yuan's amazing performance. Not only was he defeating his opponents with a single strike and progressing much quicker than the heavenly sun, but he would likely finish the first trial in record time.
You're telling me that wannabe faceless Sword Emperor is immortal? Would a mortal be able to do that? If he's able to do that while suppressing his cultivation, can you imagine how powerful he truly is?
While it was difficult to imagine anyone willingly restraining their full strength during the Sword Emperor qualifications, the spectators found it even harder to believe that Yuan was truly immortal. It only took a few hours, but Yuan finally defeated all of the masked men, and he'd done so without even getting hurt, as only Supreme Sword Aura could damage his body. Of course, the spectators had noticed this.
He completely ignored every opponent using ordinary and enhanced sword aura. This bastard didn't just attain a sword body, he's achieved the legendary enhanced sword body, which renders all enhanced sword aura useless.
Muttered one of the watching sword emperors, disbelief and awe lacing his voice. While most of the sword emperors present possessed a sword body, not a single one among them had attained the enhanced sword body. In terms of sword comprehension alone, Yuan had already surpassed them.
Just what the fuck is that bastard?
Sword Empress Huang clenched her fists in frustration after realizing Yuan had attained the enhanced sword body before her, something she'd been trying to achieve for the past 30,000 years. If she'd known that it only took Yuan a few years to achieve it, she'd probably go crazy from envy. After defeating all of the masked men, Yuan looked around and muttered.
Am I done?
He waited for a while, but when nothing happened, he calmly sat down and began cultivating. Hours passed in silence, until suddenly, Yuan's eyes snapped open. He sensed something from above. Lifting his gaze, he saw tens of thousands of semi-transparent swords materializing in the sky, each one forged from pure supreme sword aura. Without warning, they began to fall like a meteor shower, raining down upon him with the speed and force of a storm of arrows. In response, Yuan activated his limitless sword domain, unleashing a surge of supreme sword aura to intercept the falling blades. Yet to his surprise, despite his aura being clearly stronger, his sword aura was shattered upon contact, as though the incoming swords carried something beyond raw power, something deeper and more refined. Seeing this, Yuan swiftly activated his movement technique, weaving through the rain of blades with precise, fluid motion. As he dodged, his mind raced, analyzing the clash, trying to understand why his supreme sword aura had been so easily overwhelmed despite its superior strength. However, the trial offered no mercy, and the blades pursued him relentlessly, tracking his every move like homing missiles. It didn't take long for Yuan to notice something unusual, that each sword was enveloped in a thin layer of mysterious aura, and each blade's supreme sword aura was slightly different, with some being more powerful than others. Yuan narrowed his eyes, a glint of realization flashing within them. To test his theory, he struck the nearest descending blade with a precise amount of supreme sword aura, matching its level perfectly. Sure enough, the sword shattered on impact. His guess had been correct, that he needed to strike these swords with perfectly matching supreme sword aura, which tested his control and precision. Now that he knew the trick, Yuan activated limitless sword domain again. This time, he perfectly controlled the supreme sword aura to match that of the incoming blades. When the spectators witnessed Yuan's unfathomable control over his supreme sword aura, they were left in stunned silence. The sword masters among them, in particular, were overwhelmed with disbelief, for they understood how incredibly difficult it was to manipulate Supreme Sword Aura with such precision. And yet, Yuan made it look effortless. By the time Yuan had finished destroying every last sword, Tian Yuesheng was still locked in battle with the thousands of masked men. Even for a genius of his caliber, fending off so many powerful opponents at once was no simple feat, not to mention how he had to constantly swap his sword aura, something he wasn't used to. As for the others, they were still on the straight path, fighting their way to the end. 2037 immediately starting the second trial. Shortly after destroying all of the swords, a portal appeared before Yuan, prompting him to enter it.
I guess this is it for the first trial.
Yuan mumbled as he walked straight into the portal, leaving the trial and returning to the platform.
Heavens, he's already finished the first trial? And it hasn't even been a full day.
The spectators were left in awe, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Yuan's results weren't just impressive, they were unprecedented. Even the most seasoned swordmasters found themselves speechless. Yuan glanced around after returning, and upon seeing none of the other participants, he quickly realized he was the first to finish. High above him, a massive display showed the names of all participants, and his name surged to the top, claiming first place with a perfect score of 100 points. Senior Bai approached him with a smile and said,
"Welcome back. Words cannot describe my surprise when you finished the trial so quickly." "Thank you,"
Yuan said before asking,
"Do I have to wait for the others to come out, or can I continue to the next trial?" "You can immediately continue on to the next trial if you want, but you are allowed a week of rest after each trial,"
said Senior Bai, and he continued.
"And while you're allowed to cultivate during your rest, you are not allowed to consume any treasures or pills. I'd like to begin the next trial,"
Yuan said calmly, choosing to forego any rest. The first trial had been little more than a warm-up for him, barely a walk in the park, and a brief conversation with Senior Bai had been enough for him to recover physically and mentally. Senior Bai nodded and immediately opened the second door for him. Without hesitation, Yuan walked into the second door, disappearing from the platform. The spectators were stunned into silence. Not only had Yuan obliterated the first trial in record time, but now he was diving straight into the second without a moment's rest. The Sword Emperors present exchanged glances, recalling their own Sword Emperor qualifications, how they had clung to every second of rest between trials.
Ha ha ha. At this rate, we'll probably be here for a few months before he's completely done.
Wang Ming laughed out loud after seeing how fast Yuan was progressing through the Sword Emperor qualifications. Kellen wanted to respond, but he was left utterly speechless by Yuan's performance. He had never imagined Yuan's level of swordsmanship would be this high. How is his understanding of Supreme Sword Aura so profound when he'd only spent a few years inside the Holy Sword Temple? This doesn't make any sense. His existence doesn't make any damn sense. Kellen cried inwardly. It wasn't just Kellen. The Sixth Elder and Supreme Empress Huang were just as puzzled as he, as they were also aware of how little time Yuan had spent inside the Holy Sword Temple. Meanwhile, spectators from beyond the seventh heaven, such as those from the eighth and ninth heavens, were stirred into action. As Yuan's performance was simply too outstanding, countless influential factions began investigating his origins, eager to uncover his true identity. Some even went so far as to dispatch recruiters, hoping to secure him for their ranks the moment the Sword Emperor qualifications concluded. Su Jueqi, who was watching from her own office, wore a warm smile on her face as she stared at Yuan's figure through a treasure that broadcast the Sword Emperor qualifications.
"As expected of Father's reincarnation,"
she muttered. Meanwhile, at the Divine Essence Monastery, a young lady wearing a white face veil approached Xiang Biyu and asked,
"Master, what are you watching?" "It's the Sword Emperor qualifications. You should watch it with me, Azure,"
said Xiang Biyu.
"Why? It's a waste of time. Even though your rival is currently participating in it. The Heavenly Sun? I don't even consider him a rival,"
she said.
"No, I wasn't talking about the Heavenly Sun."
Xiang Biyu pointed at the masked man on the display and said,
"I'm talking about him."
Despite her disinterest, Azure asked,
"Who's that?"
She couldn't fathom how someone she's never met or heard of before could be her rival.
"You have never met him before, but his name is Yuan, and he's definitely worthy to be your rival. After all, he was able to learn my soul cultivation technique." "What did you just say?"
Behind her face veil, Azure's eyes widened. Xiang Biyu assumed she was talking about the soul cultivation technique, so she explained.
"Remember when I told you that a mortal had managed to learn my soul cultivation technique, and you didn't believe me? This is him."
However, little did Xiang Biyu know, Azure couldn't have cared less about the soul cultivation technique, and her attention was focused elsewhere.
His name. Can you repeat it? Yuan? Why? You recognize it?
Azure didn't respond, but she silently took a seat beside Xiang Biyu and began watching the Sword Emperor qualifications, which surprised her master.
I thought you said it's a waste of time.
Xiang Biyu teased her.
Perhaps, but it's not like I have anything else to do.
Azure calmly responded. Somewhere in the ninth heaven, the Heavenly Sun's family, the Tian family, was also watching.
I can't believe someone is actually ahead of our eldest.
One of the elders muttered, his gaze shifting toward a nearby couple to see their reaction. The two sat silently, their eyes sunken with exhaustion, dark circles beneath them as if they hadn't slept in decades. Yet despite their weary appearance, their aura was unmistakably vast, commanding, and unfathomably powerful. They were none other than Tian Yuexing's parents.
The trial's just begun. He'll have plenty of time to catch up,
said his father, his voice calm and full of confidence. He wore flowing black robes that matched the color of his long, neatly tied hair. The woman beside him remained silent, her attention focused on Tian Yuexing, who was close to defeating all of his opponents. While the entire world stirred in commotion over his existence, Yuan quietly stepped into his second trial. 2038 Sword Emperor Qualifications Second Trial. After stepping through the second door, Yuan found himself in a familiar setup, a solitary path stretching ahead, offering only one direction, forward. But unlike before, it wasn't a dirt path flanked by trees. This time, he stood on a narrow platform, sandwiched between two vast, seemingly endless seas on either side, their shimmering surfaces stretching out to the horizon. Though the surface of the sea was calm and without any ripples, like that of a glass of water resting on a table, Yuan could sense countless sea beasts stirring beneath the tranquil waters, their presence concealed. Once he took in his surroundings and grasped the nature of his situation, Yuan began walking forward at a calm, steady pace. With the trial's rules still unknown to him, caution was essential. After taking about a dozen careful steps, Yuan suddenly came to a halt when a faint ripple disturbed the otherwise motionless surface of the sea. The very next second, a massive sea creature burst from the water, launching itself toward him with its jaws wide open, as if intending to swallow him whole in a single bite. Yuan instinctively drew his sword, supreme sword aura already surging to the surface. But just as he was about to strike, he paused, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the familiar aura enveloping the sea creature. A knowing smile tugged at his lips. In the next instant, he withdrew his supreme sword aura and channeled ordinary sword aura instead, slashing toward the creature with precision and confidence. His sword cut right through the sea creature, killing it in a single strike. The sea creature not only had the same aura as his opponents from the last trial, but it also required Yuan to strike it with matching strength. After dispatching the sea creature, Yuan resumed his path, his pace quickening slightly with confidence. But just as he advanced a few more steps, his eyes narrowed sharply. Without hesitation, he raised his sword and swung it at the empty space in front of him, as if trying to hit an invisible enemy. In the very next moment, a sharp shattering sound rang out as Yuan's blade collided with something unseen. The invisible force became visible upon impact, revealing a sword forged from supreme sword aura. It functioned similarly to the swords from the previous trial, but with one critical difference: this one had been completely invisible to the naked eye.
He actually blocked that?
Sword Empress Huang exclaimed, eyes wide with disbelief. Every Sword Emperor qualification was unique, its trials ever-changing and unpredictable. Because of this, those who had passed them in the past couldn't pass down any concrete knowledge to the next generation. And when the current Sword Emperors witnessed the sudden invisible strike, many of them felt a rare twinge of uncertainty. Had they been in Yuan's place, facing that same hidden assault, few were confident they could have blocked it as cleanly, or even at all.
Is it just me, or does this year's Sword Emperor qualification seem much harder than the last?
One of the Sword Emperors murmured aloud, his brows furrowed in concern.
Not just the last one.
Another replied solemnly.
This year's qualifications might be the hardest in history.
While it was normal, even expected, for the trials to gradually grow more difficult over time, reflecting the world's constant evolution, such a sudden and immense spike in difficulty was completely unprecedented.
I was fairly confident those two would succeed.
The sixth elder remarked, referring to the Holy Sword Maiden and the Holy Sword King.
But after seeing the trials this year, I can't help but feel a little worried. Though this year's trials are especially difficult, I have confidence in my son and his ability,
said a fierce-looking red-haired man seated beside Sword Empress Huang. He was one of the 3 Sword Emperors of the Holy Sword clan, and his calm, unwavering tone reflected the confidence he had in his son, the Holy Sword King.
The same goes for my baby girl,
said a handsome silver-haired man seated beside the red-haired Sword Emperor, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He was the father of the Holy Sword Maiden, one of the most respected figures in the Holy Sword clan as its faction leader, and his voice carried both pride and confidence. Sword Empress Huang shook her head and said,
"It's fine to have confidence in your children, but you're fooling yourselves if you think they have a good chance. Even we would have struggled if we had faced trials this difficult during our own qualifications. And you shouldn't look down on other people's children, especially when you don't know what it's like to have any."
The red-haired Sword Emperor replied, a mocking smile tugging at his lips.
"Why the fuck would I want any children? They're too much of a pain in the ass."
She quickly responded.
"With that potty mouth of yours, I'm honestly glad you don't have any children,"
said the silver-haired Sword Emperor, shaking his head with a sigh.
"I don't think I could handle multiple potty mouths around me."
As word spread about the unprecedented difficulty of this year's Sword Emperor qualifications, more and more cultivators from across the heavens began tuning in, drawn by curiosity and the desire to witness history in the making. Meanwhile, after handling the invisible strike, Yuan pressed onward. The farther he traveled along the path, the more ripples appeared on the water's surface, each one signaling an impending attack from the sea creatures below. And without fail, every time Yuan defeated a beast, an invisible sword would lash out from the air, attempting to catch him off guard. This meant that the farther Yuan advanced, the more sea creatures he had to face at once, each wave more aggressive than the last. And as soon as he brought them down, invisible swords would strike without warning, giving him barely a moment to breathe. The trial was no longer just a test of control, it had also become a relentless gauntlet of endurance, awareness, and speed. 2039 Tian Yuexing's first trial. It took almost an entire day, but Tian Yuexing finally defeated all of the masked men.
"This is just the first trial, but I am already sweating. Why'd they make this year's qualification so difficult? Is it because of my reputation?"
Tian Yuexing wondered out loud as he waited for the portal to appear so he could leave, unaware that the trial had yet to end. However, he would soon learn the truth when nothing happened for several hours.
"The trial's still ongoing? In that case, where are the enemies?"
Tian Yuexing considered flying around, but just as he took to the sky, he noticed thousands of semi-transparent swords appearing in the sky above him. His eyes widened with surprise, and he instinctively used a martial technique to attack all of the swords at once. However, his eyes widened even more after witnessing his martial technique unexpectedly shatter from clashing with the swords.
"What?"
he exclaimed, his voice filled with disbelief. Soon, the sky above Tian Yuexing darkened as the swords descended upon him. Refusing to even consider retreat, he chose to face them head-on, unleashing his full strength in a barrage of powerful strikes. Yet no matter how much force he poured into his attacks, his blows couldn't even graze the falling swords, much less destroy them. It was as if the blades were untouchable, immune to brute strength alone. After narrowly evading the descending swords, Tian Yuexing's eyes narrowed. He noticed that the aura surrounding these swords was different from that of the masked men he had faced earlier. Realization began to stir, but with the swords relentlessly pursuing him, he had little time to think. Forced to dodge while piecing together the puzzle, he racked his brain, desperately trying to decipher the key to passing the trial. Eventually, Tian Yuexing uncovered the trick. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and he began destroying the swords one at a time. Unlike Yuan, who possessed the skills and control to dismantle them all in a single sweeping motion, Tian Yuexing had to take a more methodical approach. He focused first on the swords imbued with supreme sword aura, the type he was most familiar with. After hours of relentless dodging and careful strikes, he cleared those away and shifted his attention to the blades carrying enhanced sword aura. These proved more troublesome, often requiring multiple attempts to break through, each failure costing him precious energy and time. After 2 more days of non-stop movement and relentless effort, Tian Yuexing finally destroyed the last sword. Despite his cultivation, exhaustion weighed heavily on him, and every fiber of his being longed to collapse onto the ground and sleep. But then he remembered that his every movement was being watched by countless spectators across the 9 heavens. "I am the heavenly son, the #1 genius in the 9 heavens. I must not disgrace myself." With sheer willpower, he straightened his posture, composed himself, and stepped through the portal that appeared before him with graceful movements. When Tian Yuexing returned to the platform outside, he glanced around and saw that no other participants had finished the first trial yet, a result he fully expected. However, there was something off about the atmosphere, and the audience was oddly quiet. But Tian Yuexing didn't question it and turned to look at Senior Bai, who was standing not far away.
"I get a week to rest, correct?"
he asked.
"That's right."
Senior Bai nodded his head, confirming it. Without wasting another second, Tian Yueshing sat down and began to cultivate, not to recover his spiritual energy, but to calm and steady his mind. As a cultivator in the God Ascension realm, it would take years of constant battle to deplete his spiritual energy. However, the trial had been mentally grueling, pushing his focus, perception, and discipline to their limits. Moreover, the constant swapping of sword aura depleted his soul strength much quicker than anticipated. Shortly after, Tian Yueshing's name jumped to the second rank with a score of 95. Of course, Tian Yueshing didn't even bother to look at the ranking since he was convinced that he was first. As Tian Yueshing focused on his cultivation, the spectators mumbled to each other.
Seeing the Heavenly Sun in second place always invokes a weird feeling. Right? He's usually first at whatever he does.
Although Tian Yueshing was immersed in his cultivation, he had a strange feeling in his gut that prompted him to open his eyes, and when he saw the weird looks the spectators were giving him, he subconsciously tilted his head to look at the ranking, and when he did, he was left in disbelief. Tian Yueshing's eyes widened after seeing the name.
Yuan.
He uttered, his voice laced with disbelief. He then turned to ask Senior Bai.
There must be some sort of mistake. How is he above me when I am the only one here?
Senior Bai cleared his throat and calmly responded.
He's not here because he already started his second trial. When? When did he finish?
Tian Yueshing demanded answers.
A little over 2 days ago. Over 2 days ago? He finished the first trial in less than a day?
Tian Yueshing couldn't believe what he was hearing, nor could he fathom how Yuan had accomplished such a feat. Damn it! I don't have the time to rest if he's already 2 days ahead of me. He immediately stood up and ran toward the second door, quickly disappearing from the platform after resting only for a few minutes. Meanwhile, the rest of the participants had reached the end of the path and started fighting the thousands of masked men. Unfortunately for them, barely anyone was paying attention to their trial, as everyone was focused on Yuan, who was in the lead, and the Heavenly Sun, who was playing catch-up, a rare sight for many. As for Yuan, who was now 2 days deep into the second trial, he had killed tens of thousands of sea beasts and traveled dozens of miles on the path, but the end was still nowhere in sight. 2040 reaching the end of the second trial. After spending 2 days in the second trial, Yuan progressed to the point where he had to face hundreds of sea creatures at once with each encounter. Fortunately, their attacks were still predictable and straightforward as long as he paid attention to the ripples appearing in the water. Yuan had also realized that the sea creatures only appeared when he advanced, each encounter seemingly triggered by crossing an invisible threshold. This meant he could have paused between battles, taken breaks, and prepared for each wave. But he chose not to, and for the past 2 days, he had moved without rest, facing each encounter head-on with unwavering resolve, as if testing the limits of both the trial and himself. Yuan's performance was nothing short of astonishing, leaving the spectators speechless, many with their mouths agape, unable to believe what they were witnessing. When they watched the Heavenly Sun and the other participants undergo their trials, the sheer difficulty was palpable. Every clash and every movement carried the weight of struggle. But when they turned their gaze to Yuan, it was a different story entirely. He moved with such ease and speed that the trial itself seemed beneath him, almost as if he was mocking the efforts of every other participant.
You know, watching him, it reminds me of the Faceless Sword Emperor's qualification.
Remarked one of the Sword Emperors, eyes fixed on the display. Thanks to recorded archives of past trials, anyone with access could study them, and none were more watched or revered than the Faceless Sword Emperors, a trial he had dominated with unmatched grace and power.
Are we witnessing the birth of a second Faceless Sword Emperor?
Someone else murmured, the question lingering in the air like a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. Meanwhile, the moment Tian Yueshing stepped into the area for the second trial, he began walking forward without hesitation, wasting no time to observe his surroundings. There was no room for delay in his mind. He knew he was already behind, and every second counted if he hoped to catch up to Yuan. While his actions could be seen as reckless, Tian Yueshing was confident in his own abilities. When the first sea creature attacked a few steps later, Tian Yueshing defeated it with a single strike. I don't know how you managed to get ahead of me, but it won't last. Tian Yueshing thought to himself, determination flaring in his eyes as he pressed forward. But just a few steps later, his thoughts were abruptly cut off. His instincts flared like lightning, screaming danger. Without thinking, he raised his sword in front of him, just in time to somewhat block the invisible sword. However, his reaction was just a moment too slow. Though he managed to intercept part of the strike, the invisible sword still slipped through his guard, slicing into his left arm and leaving a deep, bleeding gash. Tian Yueshing gritted his teeth in frustration, his eyes narrowing at the wound. The wound on his arm was minor, something he could easily ignore, but the fact that he'd been struck at all, and by such a simple trick, gnawed at his pride. He couldn't accept making such a blunder, not with so many people watching. Seconds later, Tian Yuesheng sensed the invisible sword circling back for a second strike. This time, fully alert and focused, he met it head-on. With a precise swing infused with his supreme sword aura, he shattered the blade cleanly, redeeming his earlier mistake in a single, decisive motion. After overcoming the first encounter, Tian Yuesheng didn't immediately charge forward to chase after Yuan. Instead, he stood still, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. The weight of his earlier misstep lingered, and he knew rushing in recklessly would only lead to more mistakes.
What the heck am I doing? There's no need to rush or panic. I'll definitely catch up and reclaim my rank. It's only natural and a matter of time.
He muttered to himself. When he opened his eyes, they were filled with confidence and renewed focus, and he continued forward with immense concentration, no longer paying attention to Yuan being ahead. Time passed swiftly, and Yuan had now entered his fourth day within the second trial. Having advanced without pause, the difficulty had escalated dramatically. Each encounter now unleashed thousands of sea creatures upon him at once, their numbers swelling like tidal waves with every step he took. However, despite the overwhelming numbers, Yuan dispatched them all within moments, effortlessly cutting them down with his limitless sword domain. After days of honing his control to an even higher level, his manipulation of sword auras had become as natural as breathing. With each step forward, he moved calmly and gracefully, and what was meant to be a grueling trial now appeared more like a leisurely stroll through the park. To the spectators, it was no longer just impressive, it was surreal.
How long do you think he'll be able to keep up this pace?
The Holy Sword Maiden's father asked aloud, his gaze fixed on the image of Yuan effortlessly advancing the trial.
Well.
The Holy Sword King's father replied, arms crossed in thought.
The first and second trials follow the same general structure, but the second is far more brutal in scale. He might breeze through this, but the real challenge begins in the later trials when everything changes. That's when we'll see if he can keep his pace.
By the end of the fourth day, Yuan finally caught sight of the path's end in the distance, and just as he expected, it opened into another vast arena. Its wide, circular expanse radiated an ominous stillness. As Yuan stepped into the center of the arena, the stillness shattered. The calm water began to tremble, and a deep, resonating ripple spread outward across the surface. Moments later, several glowing orbs appeared just beneath the water, pulsing with an eerie light. Then, with a thunderous roar and a violent surge, a colossal sea creature with many tentacles erupted from the depths like a volcanic explosion, water cascading from its body as it loomed high above Yuan.
This is...
Behind his mask, Yuan's eyes widened in surprise the moment he laid